Okay, next we're going to do question number 6 on the English test. Let's begin by reading the sentence as is. As Moss has observed, however, a calf must learn how to use its trunk. Okay, so this is a classic category of questions called transition word questions. So I'm going to put the word transition here. I want you to write that down. So it's a certain category of questions, and it has a couple different steps in order to answer these correctly. Now, if you're not familiar with your transition words, you're going to want to get familiar with them, or at least get familiar with the different categories. So why don't you take a look at this sheet right here, and you can pause this and write this down if you need to. And you could say that this is a pretty complete list of transition words. So here is adding, sequences, illustrating or examples. You have cause and effect words, comparing, qualifying, contrasting, and pay attention to these two because they're easily confused with one another, and emphasizing. I'm not going to go into the nuances of each of these together in this video, but use this as your starting point if you're not sure how to distinguish between one transition word and the next. Okay, so now let's go back. So after you're familiar with the different transition words and the categories, we're going to want a good technique for assessing what transition word best goes here. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do is find some context. So you're going to want to read before, and you're going to want to read after the transition word. So here's the transition word, however. I'm going to bracket that. And I'm going to read the sentence before, right? It gives us some context. And then I'm going to read the sentence after. So I'll be right here. And then the sentence after is this one. Let's go down to here. Great. Now the next thing I'm going to do is pick my own word. I'm going to pick my own transition word, some word that I think best fits the sentence. And when I say pick my own word, I'm not going to read these off because it's going to color my judgment. So in fact, I'd almost want to just get rid of them so I don't have to think about them. And that way I can figure out which word goes in this spot without having to feel like I was influenced by one of these answers. Okay, so let's begin. A key finding from her intensive field studies is the extent to which elephant survival depends on learned behavior. Okay, so what we just said here is that elephant survival is dependent on learned behavior. As Moss has observed, a calf must learn how to use its trunk. At first, a young elephant will drink by kneeling down at the water's edge, and it sips directly in its mouth. Okay, so the first learned behavior that a calf was observed by Moss learning is how to use its trunk. So it looks to me like we went from a general statement to something specific. In fact, it's more of an example, isn't it? So what I did was I read before and I read after, and if I were to pick my own word, I would probably pick for example. As Moss has observed, for example, a calf must learn how to use its trunk. Right, that's an example of a learned behavior that we mentioned before. But if you weren't quite sure, you could rattle off a few of these in your mind, and you would recognize that illustrating is the correct category that I'd be looking for. And I picked for example because that's the one that pops into my mind the best, but honestly, you could have used any one of these, and this is not a finite list. Okay, so now what we want is one of these transition words that actually illustrate an example. Well, it's definitely not however, right? Because if we go into this category, however is a qualifying transition word, not an illustrating transition word. So I would get rid of that, and that would be answer choice F. For instance, and hopefully it's in here. Yep, you see how for instance is in the same category as for example? So because it's analogous, I know that this is going to be the right answer because I chose a for instance or for example on my own by reading this passage. As always, as additional and by now is, you could say it's temporal or it's sequential. So I would get rid of those two. And this is how you want to answer transition word questions. So the first thing you want to do is recognize as you read it that these are transition words, and it's asking us to figure out which one best fits the context of this passage at this spot. Next, if you're not familiar with your transition words or the categories, you want to make sure you get familiar with them, and that way you can easily figure out which one best goes here. Then you're going to read before and you're going to read after. Now, how far you read before and how far you read after really just depends on the context of the passage. The rule of thumb is you just want to read as much as you need in order to understand what the correct transition word would be. Remember not to use this word or use these words when trying to figure that out. They will color your judgment, so it's best to just leave them be, or you can gray them out if you need to. Then you're going to want to pick your own word. Once you've picked your own word that best fits the transition, then you're going to want to look for an analogous word. Or maybe you got lucky and the word that you picked is actually one of these words here. And this is how you go through transition words. Thank you.